So how come that one day you or your neighbor knocks on your door and basically shoots your family, even though you've known each other for decades? And an inhabitant of Sarajevo told this American report, and he said, don't be so naive. Imagine that the Ku Klux Klan takes over CNN in the US.
This is the Rhyming Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval or authoritarian takeover.
We hope these interviews can help us understand what's happening in the United States right now and how decent people can fight against it.
I'm Jeremy Goldkorn. My Jewish Latvian grandparents immigrated to South Africa around World War II, and I grew up in the apartheid era in Johannesburg, just down the road from Elon Musk. I lived in China for 20 years, and I've been living in Nashville, Tennessee, in the American South since 2015. So I could not be happier to welcome my dear friend Maria Repnikova, who also happens to be a Latvian Jew, to join me as co-host on Rhyming Chaos for today and for the future. Maria's family has been a little less mixed than mine, I should add, and she actually speaks Latvian and Russian, whereas I only speak a few bits of kitchen Yiddish. But more importantly for the show, Maria is a scholar of authoritarian politics, especially Chinese media politics, including journalism, propaganda, and soft power. She also studies Russia.
Thank you. Very excited to be part of the team and to finally work with the talented Jeremy Goldkorn.
That's too sweet, you flatterer, Maria. I am actually the one who is more excited. And now I am trying to work on a joke that begins: two Latvian Jews walk into a bar. Anyway, Maria and I want to do some ambitious things, so I want to quickly ask our listeners, if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com. One of the ambitious things we want to do is host a weekly Shabbat prepper, what we're calling our Getting By show. Starting next week, May 16 at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to host an online get-together where we discuss how we got by in the previous week in Trump and Musk's America and how we plan to fight American fascism without driving ourselves crazy. We'll send the details of these weekly gatherings to you if you subscribe to our newsletter at rhymingchaos.com. You don't need to take out a paid subscription to get updates, but we would love it if you would. Today, we are really happy to be speaking to Filip Nobel, who is the editor-at-large for Global Voices, which describes itself as an international community of writers, bloggers, and digital activists that aim to translate and report on what is being said in citizen media worldwide.
Filip is also a senior China analyst at AMO, the Prague-based Association for International Affairs dedicated to research and education in the field of international relations and Czech foreign policy. From 2006 to 2016, Filip was the managing director for Internews China, training journalists and lawyers, amongst other actors and people at large. That is how I first met him in 2008. I was attending a workshop on media ethics while doing fieldwork for my doctorate in Beijing. And Filip also leads a parallel life as a translator and speaks a million languages fluently, including Russian, Mandarin, Chinese, Czech, and many others. He currently divides his time between three wonderful places: Taiwan, Prague, and Dakar. Welcome again, Filip.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be on the show.
Let me say a few more words about Filip's work. Right now, he's focusing on Chinese-speaking diaspora communities, relations between China and French-speaking Africa, Taiwan-Ukraine relations, and on the ways in which Russian and Chinese speakers discuss the idea of decolonization, which is an important strand of thinking in international academia that seeks to understand how previously colonized countries can, in the 21st century, find their own identities and cast off their subservient pasts.
Filip, welcome again to the show. It's so great to have you, and thank you for joining us amidst your very busy travel schedule. You just got back from Nepal, right?
Definitely. I was there for training with Sinophone journalists and also journalists from the Global South. And I'm very happy to be with both of you. And as we chatted just before we started, it feels a bit nostalgic because definitely the world has changed since we first met in Beijing and worked and lived there. So I'm very excited, and I'm sure we'll be reminiscing and discussing that time as well.
Yes. So my first question kind of leads into that time a little bit, although I guess it also intersects with the current, is that you worked quite a lot on freedom of expression issues in China, but also in Taiwan, in Eastern Europe, and many other places where freedom of expression is at a threat or facing certain threats from the government and multiple other entities. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about the work you've done in these places. Maybe share some examples of things that struck you as really successful, but also maybe things that just you want to reminisce about or share with a larger audience about the kind of tough, challenging work of protecting, defending freedom of expression and the ups and downs of that work as well. It's obviously very clear these days that it's very tumultuous and zigzag process.
Definitely. I mean, I think that we can maybe start with China. I first studied a little bit in Beijing in 96, which was, before the internet. We still had pagers, and it was definitely just basically 7 years after the Tiananmen massacre, but there was still a bit of a hope. And then I came back in 2006, so 2 years before the Beijing Summer Olympics, where definitely China was opening up. And I think this is the time that we share more or less when we sort of were working in China. And so what I saw was that precisely there was a sort of arch of hope and opening, I would say, from the early 2000s to probably to 2012, 2013, when Mr. Xi Jinping took over and led the country. So it was both very inspiring to see how lawyers, journalists, but also bloggers were sort of taking on freedom of expression issues at the scale of China, which was not easy. It was by no means a sort of democratic time or anything like that, but it did give us a lot of hope, and we did have a lot of space on a certain number of issues that we could discuss. And especially when Weibo happened and Weixin, there was this sort
Maybe
of...
we can just explain those because some of our listeners aren't familiar with China. So Weibo is we used to call it China's Twitter, microblogging platform. And then Weixin or WeChat is a completely different beast, which is sort of like WhatsApp combined with Facebook, combined with PayPal and Venmo, combined with your identity documents.
Weixin is definitely a pile of many, many apps if you look at outside of China.
All in one, yeah.
It was never black and white. One story that I always tell to people even today, even though when we talk about, how China looked like until 2012, people look at me and think, you're probably making things up. But because I was training a lot of journalists and lawyers and judges who were focusing on freedom of expression, especially online, there was a sort of catchphrase that I remember, which was basically, if you're involved in a lawsuit, do not hire a lawyer, but actually hire a blogger or someone who is big on Weibo, on this social media platform. And the reasoning behind this was that if you go through the traditional legal system, and you're not specifically in power, you're a simple citizen, it will probably take many years before you might have a hope of actually getting justice, versus either hiring or just convincing someone who is big on Weibo, who has literally millions of followers, to not necessarily mention your case, but talk about the issue, because then there will be a reaction across China, and that reaction will translate into pressure maybe on the legal system, and your case might move forward. But of course, there is a huge danger in that, because if you are what we would call today, influencer, VIP influencer, it doesn't mean that you understand justice, it doesn't mean that you understand what was behind the case. So it's a sort of like popular justice in the hands of individuals who might have good intentions, but are definitely not qualified to deliver justice. Nevertheless, you understand that people who are stuck in a situation might see this as a quick response. And these were precisely the issues that we were discussing in very interesting seminars, usually on campuses, because that was a safe space where we could all of us could meet. Chinese, foreigners, lawyers, journalists, judges, including from the Supreme Court of China, which I had the privilege to also take outside of China to look at other legal systems, for example, in the Netherlands. So this, what I describe now, for people who have not known this period of time in China, sounds pretty much like fantasy, that I'm making up stories. The fact that I could take judges from the Supreme Court of China on the plane, and we would tour the Netherlands for 10 days and, interact with Dutch judges.
And who were you working for, Filip, when you were doing this?
So this was from 2006 to 2016, when I was working for the US-based media development organization called Internews, which heavily depends on a US government funding. So basically now is unable to function pretty much because of the US freeze. But this was a very different period, when precisely we had a significant program in China, and I was heading this for a decade. And as I said, from 2006 to 2012, 13, since we were working mostly with universities, and there are 800 journalism departments in a country like China, the phone was ringing off the hook in our little office in a hutong in old Beijing. And then the phone went silent, because suddenly all our partners got other phone calls from the Chinese government to prevent them from working with us. And so suddenly went from super popular and extremely busy. We had a very small team of less than 10 people, basically sitting in our office and hoping that someone would be brave enough to actually call and maybe consider some cooperation. And so the first ones to go were basically in the provinces. We could still do certain things in in the capital city. And then we went from having trainings on campus to what we would call it in Chinese salon, like the French word salon, which is sort of more informal, more in a cafe, in a tea house, where you could still have very interesting conversation, honestly, but it was very low profile, obviously a very small number of participants. And that was the issue, is that if it was under 10 or 12 people, you could still claim that it was just a friendly conversation among friends. But beyond that, then it looked like an official training. And then, of course, different police and law enforcement.
And what year was that when the provinces stopped calling?
I remember very precisely. The first bad experience was in 2013 in Kunming, in Yunnan, literally at midnight, when I got a phone call from our local partner at a university who said, "Are you in your room? We need to talk." And when he said, "We need to talk," I already knew what he meant. And then he came and he explained that he really apologized because we were paying for all the air tickets, hotel, and we would bring something like 20 people from all over China for 2 or 3 days to have this discussion. And suddenly that became impossible. And there was no point asking why, because it was very clear to everyone that he had received orders from above that we were no longer tolerable, I would say. And so that started outside of Beijing.
That would have coincided with the crackdown on the Big V, the so-called Big V bloggers, the mega influencers who were sort of a controversial and occasionally highly critical force in the public sphere. I think that started in August that year when they arrested Charles Xue, who was a very influential blogger. He got fixed. He got bussed for, I think, with prostitutes. And then he was humiliated into a self-confession on statewide CCTV television news broadcast.
And I think it also corresponded to, just to explain to people who might not be so familiar with China, is that it's important to remind all of us, and that's where we get, I think, very nostalgic, is that China did have a very vibrant media ecosystem, especially in the south of China, around Guangzhou and outlets like Nanfang Zhoumo, where we actually would invite a lot of journalists, editors to participate or even to train other journalists, because there were, of course, very clear red lines. You couldn't talk about, for example, top party corruption, about specific ethnic issues, but you could still conduct investigations that I would argue were at the same level and quality of investigation in Europe, in Japan, in the US, anywhere else, in South Africa. So people knew how to navigate and they could still make excellent journalism. But that went also, it was all coordinated. Chinese civil society, independent Chinese media, and then foreign NGOs. We were all targeted pretty much within 2 or 3 years. And everyone had to leave, shut down, or basically change career. And when I think of Beijing today, including both of you, I don't have any friends left now in Beijing, whether Chinese or foreigner. Literally, it's very sad.
Quite remarkable.
Yes.
Yeah, very sad. And given how much time you've spent there, how many friends surrounded you, as I remember in those times, it's really quite something to state. Yeah, I remember that time very well as I was doing my research on Chinese media and all the fascinating investigations I was analyzing for my first book, just how vibrant Chinese media sphere was and how a lot of audiences in the US would kind of doubt that perspective when I would present this work, that it's impossible in China, there cannot be investigative journalism. And yet there was that period of very lively media space. But I wanted to kind of jump into other contexts because you've worked obviously in other places as well, and you've studied and dealt with Russia, also Eastern Europe, and this kind of zigzags or tribulations where you're working in this media of freedom space, and depending on these unpredictable waves, right, of government crackdowns that kind of end up trickling down to various local levels and for self-censorship taking place as well. Do you see this also happening in Russia and other spaces? Do you think this is a trend beyond China that we're living through at the moment, where it's just becoming harder and harder to do this kind of work?
I'm afraid yes, but I know you know the answer. But definitely, besides China, I worked for a long time in Central Asia. I also grew up in Tashkent, but I was based in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, more or less from 99 to 2006, most of the time. And so back then, Kyrgyzstan was called, because of the high mountains, but also because of the sort of comparatively freer space, the Switzerland of Central Asia. And to some extent, it sounds like a cliche, but it was true in the sense that the Kyrgyz government was much more tolerant to more independent media, civil society. A lot of international, but also regional organizations were all based in Bishkek. And for the longest period of time, people from Uzbekistan, from Kazakhstan, actually were very jealous about, the freedom that we had in Bishkek and the things that, again, that we could do that to them sounded absolutely impossible. And I'm not even talking about Turkmenistan or how Tajikistan evolved to be, Turkmenistan is called the North Korea of Central Asia. it is an exaggeration, but, it tells a lot about the lack of freedom. And again, I still go back to Bishkek, to Kyrgyzstan quite often, even after China, and the situation is degrading a lot. All that space, whether it's independent media, whether it's civil society, and just in general, the sort of political freedom, most of it is gone. There are many reasons, of course. I mean, we could talk about this for hours. Russia does have an influence, and even before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But it's also because local governments see that precisely China, Russia can get away with very autocratic systems, and that Europe is very far away. The US is very far away. The US was involved a little bit during, its sort of presence in Afghanistan. There was a US military base in Bishkek, which you can debate whether that was good or bad, but it did, I think, in terms of relative political and media freedom, probably had a positive impact. But I'm also half Czech, and when I see what is happening in Hungary and in our neighboring country, Slovakia, it's basically those two countries are EU members, and you'd think, okay, at least within the EU, democracy, freedom of expression, independence of the judiciary are guaranteed, and people value this. And we see that it's falling apart very quickly. And even in the Czech Republic, we have elections coming in September, and we will probably have the return of a previous prime minister, Mr. Babiš, who, is known of having collaborated with the secret services of Czechoslovakia under socialism. And just like Orbán, he has been democratically elected. He will probably be again democratically elected. And I think that's the real issue, is that, of course, the elites in the capitals think that why are those quote unquote dumb people in the countryside voting for autocrats, which I think doesn't help us. And I think it's the same situation in the US, because if you sort of divide the society and refuse to engage and also refuse to acknowledge the real social issues of a lot of people who are not privileged as the elites in the capitals, then you have this divide. But because there are the sheer numbers of those people, including retired people, which is specific to Central Europe, when they vote, they will choose people who promise cheap food, allegedly more jobs, and who sort of build their political agenda on this antagonism between the capital and the rest of the country, the more educated and more privileged people who speak English or very literate in computers, who travel, versus the other ones who don't have access to all those resources. But those people vote, and actually they vote more than the so-called elites. So those leaders get democratically elected. So this shift and this loss of space that all of us have witnessed in China and in Russia and in Central Asia and in the Caucasus. Let's talk 1 minute about Georgia, which again was just like Kyrgyzstan was the sort of, the role model for Central Asia. The country of Georgia in the Caucasus had the same label. And I lived there, I worked there, and it was true, absolutely, in terms of, again, media freedom, civil society. It was the place where Armenians and Azerbaijanis could meet. So it was a very privileged country that, inspired the entire region, including Iran. That's maybe the way forward. And look at what is happening now in Georgia.
You segged into the United States a little bit, and then you retreated back into the Caucasus. But let's go back to the United States, where Maria and I live. How do you see the state of media freedom in the United States now? How threatened is it? And do you see Trumpian tactics of dealing with the media? Do you see anything that reminds you of Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, any of the other autocrats under whose rule you've had the pleasure of living?
Right. I mean, I'm definitely no expert on the US. I used to go, when I was working for Internews, twice a year, mostly on the East and West Coast. I never really traveled.
Hanging out with the elites, the urban elites.
Exactly. I did go to Texas once, and I really enjoyed it, I have to say. But I think that overall, that's what I tell to everyone, that populism works, whether we like it or not. That's a terrible thing to say, but we have to acknowledge and we have to understand why populism works and why Trump was elected democratically, more or less, I think, once, and now a second time. And most of my friends in the US are not particularly supportive of him. And I always, ask my friends, because I tell them, look, I don't live in the US, I'm not American, so you probably know it better. Do you think he's going to be elected? The first time around, all my friends said no. And then the second time, certainly not, because we saw what happened once. And yet he's there and more or less democratically elected. So to me, it's precisely, there is probably no major difference between, let's say, Hungary, Slovakia, or the US in that sense, because I think that this sort of divide of, I would say, arrogancy of certain elites that refuse to acknowledge the lived experience of people who, again, don't have all those privileges, plus precisely.
Filip, I'm enjoying you destroying us urban elites and with our snobbishness. But can we go back to the question of media freedom specifically? What's your sense of what's happening now in the United States?
But I think precisely that's why I mentioned that, because I think that is, again, the other thing that is true for, I think, most societies around the world, is that populism is linked to the comfort bubble that we all have in terms of news consumption, and also the fact that everything is now pretty much infotainment, in the sense that you do not want to have so-called boring news, but you want to be entertained. And I just did recently a research on Chinese diasporas in Europe and asked different people, where do you get your information as a Chinese citizen living in Europe? Pretty much 99% of the people say we never go to media outlets, web pages. We only get it, again, from Weixin, public accounts, from social media. And so whether you're the so-called elite or the so-called anti-establishment, you live in a media bubble that supports the main ideas that precisely are aligned to this sort of, we can call it propaganda, we can call it, main ideas. And people do not want, I think, to engage in a public space. If you think of the old media where you had, columns, you had people from different opinion writing different pieces. And I think that most people until probably the 70s, 80s would read a newspaper, let's say in Europe or probably also in the US, and I think would be exposed to different opinions, to different ideas. But if you think now of your media consumption, however you want to call it, and if you're not a media scholar, like some of us are, of course, then you tend to just have one very specific perspective, and you have enough media content to confirm that, yes, this is our truth. These are our facts. And so there is no need for you to challenge that, to think that they might be a completely different experience, a different perspective. And that aligns with populism. And that's why you can have Fox News, which is a planet of its own. You can have Russian TV that has been controlled by Putin for 20 years. The other story that stuck with me in the 90s when I was living in Prague, because we had quite a large number of war refugees from the dismantling of Yugoslavia. And so back then I was reading a lot of books, the Civil War and the ethnic cleansing war in former Yugoslavia. And I remember there was an American journalist who was in Sarajevo and was asking people there, look, you're Serbian, you're Croatian, you're Bosniak, you're Jewish, you're Czech, whatever. And you've been going to kindergarten and then to school with, people of different religions, different ethnicities, and you've been neighbors for decades. And Sarajevo was very well known for being a city of a high rate of inter-ethnic and cross-faith marriage rate. It's very common. People had very sort of complicated origins. So how come that one day you or your neighbor knocks on your door and basically shoots your family, even though you've known each other for decades? And an inhabitant of Sarajevo told this American report, and he said, don't be so naive. Imagine that the Ku Klux Klan takes over CNN in the US. I can guarantee you that within 2 years, the US will look like Bosnia today. This was in the mid-90s, before really the internet bubble, and the internet had just started, at least in Central Europe. And I was always shocked by this sentence, and it kept me thinking that none of us are immune. And I think that the biggest problem that I see with the US right now is this idea of American exceptionalism. I think that's the biggest danger that is facing American society, because if you think, for example, of refugees and migration, I think it's very striking. The whole world for the past 200 years has looked at the US as a country where you can flee for religious, for gender, for whatever issues, for whatever reasons. It is supposed to be the place where you can flee and experience freedom. And now we see that there are US, of course, very privileged people, academics, journalists, researchers who are no longer feel safe to work or to do their work, and who are moving to Canada or to Europe. And I think that this is an experience that more Americans are going to have. But I think that you need to embrace it, because you also learn a lot from, migration. And both of your family histories are about that. My mom, who is Czech, was in France in 1968 when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia, and she stayed on. So we all have histories in our families of being refugees or not really having a choice and migrating. But I think that what mainstream US society needs to understand is that there might be now a reverse trend where some of you will feel that it's better to leave the US, maybe not forever, because hopefully, there will be elections and there will not be a third mandate with Mr. Trump. But I think that that's something that, for example, people who are from China, who are from the former Soviet Union, who are from Central Europe and other places, Nigeria, you name it, and I'm sure South Africa, that's a sort of very normal thing to consider migration, that suddenly you have to leave. It's a sort of a social death. You were someone big and important in your country, and suddenly you jump on a boat, on a plane, and you're basically a nobody in the new country. And that's something that I think we'll see more and more.
Yeah, the reverse migration trend. I think a lot of people are starting to consider. Of course, we'll talk about resistance and survival, in this times a little bit later on in our discussion. And this is certainly one of the tactics we can think of as just, fleeing or temporarily escaping as a form of enduring something as well. And what does that look like? But it's shifting towards a little bit of diagnosis kind of here, of thinking about the symptoms that we would look for when we're diagnosing or thinking about Americans failing democracy or authoritarian takeover. What you described to me sounded like one of the symptoms as well. It's like, well, once you're starting to see this reverse migration wave, that could be one of these sort of trends we could watch for to diagnose that, okay, something is really changing here. It's like this used to be a country that attracts immigrants, talent, all kinds of people fleeing here. And now people are fleeing out of the US as one of these sort of tools or lenses to think about the shift that we're experiencing here. There are other sort of symptoms that maybe you would look for to understand or to kind of capture what's happening here based on your experience of living in China and studying and working in all these other countries. What are some of the signs you would see and think, oh yeah, something here is really transformative, or things are really starting to look a little bit like or a lot like they're moving in the direction of, let's say, an authoritarian kind of society and political system?
Definitely. There's a term that I like to use, which is, parallel polis, which is basically, you have the official, let's say, media, the official cultural life, also the official academic life. And if you especially look at the history of the former Soviet space and also China, but even, Taiwan until its democratization at the end of the 80s, a lot of public intellectuals, a lot of artists basically recreated all the institutions outside of the mainstream. And I don't know enough about, the US, especially today, to know. Maybe you see those signs or not. But I'm always fascinated by people who create underground universities, underground media. And the whole history of Central Europe, of the Samizdat, for example, that started in the Soviet Union. In Czechoslovakia, it was very related also to theater. People had, performances in apartments. You had people in Kosovo who had their whole university and educational system being taught in apartments or, in basements. And I think this idea of...
Filip, sorry to interrupt. Did you say parallel?
Polis.
Police.
The Greek word for city, right?
Okay.
Yes.
And so this is, in fact, a very hopeful thing in some ways.
Yeah.
But you're saying it's also a symptom of authoritarian takeover when you start seeing alternative spaces, alternative polis developing. That's a symptom of
something changing.
The fact that they can't exist out in the open.
Exactly. That's a question that I have maybe for you, because you are American and you live in that country. But I think that at some point people realize that you don't want you, and especially your children, to be completely brainwashed, indoctrinated by the official narrative, discourse, propaganda, education, you name it. And so what do you do? One opportunity, as we just discussed, is to flee. But, that's not, always possible, especially if you have, older relatives or whatever. It's a very hard decision. It's usually a very dramatic one. There's a lot of personal risk, also risk for the people who stay behind. I think in Russian and in Czech, we all had this term of also internal migration, which was basically that you pretend to function in that society officially. You even go to work and you go to the party, meetings, and you chant the slogans and you sort of look like a random obedient citizen. At the same time, you come home, and whether it's in the evening or on a Saturday or Sunday, you have your class of, history, of religion, of philosophy. If you think of Václav Havel, the Czech philosopher dissident and then first president of independent Czech Republic, that was his life. It was in the countryside house, in the, what we call in Russian, dacha, in Czech chata, where you had seminars on philosophy, on human rights, and you had Catholics and atheists and communists and people from Poland crossing the mountains and coming and chatting. So you recreated the whole society. what I see is very interesting also because, as I said, I work on Chinese diasporas, is that I also see this in the diaspora. So, for example, you now have a lot of Chinese language bookstores and civil society opening in Europe, but also in Japan, but also in the US. So people are recreating an entire cultural media civil society outside of their home country or sort of in an underground way. And I think that this is a very healthy way to respond to autocracy because you're investing in the future and you're investing in your own sort of dignity and morality that, yes, you have to survive. And I don't think we can say that it's a compromise, that you're not leaving the country or you're not becoming an open dissident. Everyone makes different choices. We were not here to judge anyone. But I think that for a lot of people, to sustain the autocracy, to invest in the future, and to keep hope is precisely to have this parallel polis where the official university and the underground university. You have the official media, which is more propaganda, and then you have the very interesting, fanzine or just samizdat publication that is remarkable because in the case of Russia, I think it's very interesting. Maria knows it very well. There was this Soviet tradition of samizdat, but if you look at, for example, an exile, a Russophone media outlet like Medusa, which is based in Latvia, as you know. I always also mention the fact that they created their news because they're being blocked in Russia so that you can turn any article into a PDF and then send it by email to your friends and to especially older Russian citizens who are not necessarily very savvy with, VPN and the internet. So we see that it's the same thinking. We have to reach our audience, and our audience are maybe people who are in their 70s, and they're not going to, open a VPN and kind of figure out how it works. Okay, so email is maybe less censored, less checked. So you turn the story into a PDF, and maybe for some people you're able to print it on paper. And then you have a sort of handmade edition, just like in the 70s.
Yeah, I think these tactics we're not quite maybe there yet in the US because there's a lot of reactivity still. Sort of people are just waking up to this idea that, okay, there's a big shift that's undergoing and it's very chaotic because so much is happening at the local level and different states have different restrictions, like at universities or, just different people experiencing different realities in America, I think, depending on where you live, who you interact with. So I'm seeing some micro acts like that, for example, with public health professionals trying to save databases that are being deleted, just kind of trying to basically save what's there and then you save it for the future. So we know what has been studied, how it's been studied, what kind of things worked. And then once things hopefully become normalized again, you have all the tools and all the information to restart it. I wonder if other institutions are doing that as well. I've heard about libraries and other spaces where things are being kind of demolished, that there are alternative sort of, again, policies or communities that are saving some of these sources for the future. So that's something I've noticed, but also name changes, right? Like changing names of classes, anything with critical race theory or something that sounds overly contentious for a current moment here, just changing it and then still teaching it while not having the name, right, the label, right? Like DI changing.
You call it the history of the South.
Yeah, exactly. The history of the glorious South. So this kind of very soft approaches that to me, they're very much similar to what, I've observed in China, for instance, in the past, right?
Exactly. But I think that maybe that's what at least this generation of Americans need to learn is, for example, to play with censorship because you're definitely not at the level of North Korea and if you're going to get there. So this means that even in North Korea, actually, there are holes in the censorship. And I think that that's where maybe people who have a background in the former Soviet space or in China are at an advantage because, first of all, they understand that censorship is never absolute. It's a push back and forward. So precisely as you said, like when we did our trainings and you were present at some of them, Maria, you probably remember that because in the Chinese system, you need to have a sort of official banner, an official title of the seminar and even a banner that is printed. And so we would always use very boring terms, for example, studying the rule of law. So we sounded probably like the Chinese Communist Party. And we did talk about rule of law, but of course, we have a very, very different perspective. And we had very lively discussions. So this is a game that we're all ready to play because that was the only way to actually have to get to this very interesting conversation. And so I think that that's what I hope a lot of very creative people in the US need to learn that, if this is banned, then be creative and change the term. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that I think, again, where I think people from Russia or China have an advantage is that, I grew up in the Soviet Union, so I was inoculated from age 7 against, institutions and sort of government narratives because we all knew it was a huge, huge lie. that we had to perform outside. But, we had a sort of safe space in the family with friends, with trusted people where we could do something else. And I think that very early on, I understood, even without thinking that I would be, for example, journalist, that you can be your own institution. You actually have power to create something. And I think that that's something that maybe is difficult for many mainstream Americans to think that you can be precisely that parallel. You can be that night school.
But we have another problem here as well, Filip, in the sense that, you talked earlier about media bubbles. And from my point of view, that seems to be a worse problem here. I mean, we're free to do this podcast. I'm free to rant on Blue Sky about how I think Elon Musk should be investigated and audited and probably imprisoned, and the same for Trump. And the armed men haven't come to my door yet. But my neighbor has got Fox News and a Twitter feed of junk all day long. What do I do to get my neighbor out of his bubble? I mean, I can make my own polis in my house here, and it's very nice. Additional layer of complication is you're seeing the apparent capitulation of all the major internet companies to Trumpism. For example, Google's decision to use Trump's Gulf of America name for the Gulf of Mexico, and Jeff Bezos's neutering of the Washington Post. And even the fact that the New York Times, you can look at its homepage or the front page of the print edition on any day, and it looks like it's just another normal day in America. There's no sense of outrage at some of the crimes being committed against democracy. So what would your advice be to try and pop other people's bubbles?
I mean, it sounds very cliche, but I think that we need to engage. If your neighbor is the person you describe, and probably both of you have many neighbors or even members of your family, I mean, it's the same in Europe, you're no exception. It's really, I think, to turn to the analog life, to turn off the digital life precisely, and to have very difficult conversations with people who completely disagree. I'm not here to sort of preach peace in a very naive way, but it's more about really listening and trying to understand why, for example, people who watch only Russian TV or Fox TV or a CCTV in China and have very little what we would call critical thinking to really take very practical issues, the hardest issues in those societies. In Central Europe, it's the fact that, we don't want any migrants. We're going to turn into a Sharia state within 5 seconds, which is what the former Czech president had said on the record. And really to sit down with people and try to deconstruct, but without using the term deconstruct and all this sort of intellectual jargon, but try to think and tell, for example, what I would say to people in the Czech Republic, like, look, after 1968, the Soviet invasion, about 100,000 Czechs had to flee. And so we were also refugees in other countries. And in some countries, we were well treated, and in others, not so well. So it happened to us. Now it happens to people from Syria or Afghanistan. And yeah, it's a different culture. Yes, it's a different religion. But can we sort of go back to your own family history, because everyone has a family member that actually became a refugee? It's very painful. It's very difficult. There's no guarantee of success. You get into ugly conversations or fights at some point. But I don't see any other way to actually remain as a society and not precisely at those two camps.
So I'm going to have to invite that neighbor for dinner.
Cook something tasty.
Barbecue, exactly.
Let's hope he eats Chinese food.
Cook some strange things. Turn off the phone. Hand your phone over here and put it on the shelf. No television. Yeah, the empathy building, the breaking of the walls, the challenging work of that sometimes, takes a long time to get to results, but yet it's still meaningful. Yeah.
I mean, I think that the very opposite of the bubble is precisely the conversation, but the real one, ideally without a screen.
Right.
It's very nice to talk, but nothing replaces in person.
In person.
Because, if you boil it down to very basic human emotions and issues of, life, death, having a future for you or your children, some people will actually begin to listen and to think that, maybe it's a bit more complicated than that. But there's never a guarantee of success, because you might have this enlightening conversation on a Saturday afternoon, but then on Monday, both of you go back to work and you go back to your bubble. And then there's a new drama happening, as we now witness in US politics. And that wonderful conversation gets buried. Do you have another weekend to talk to your neighbor? If you do, that's great. But honestly, I don't have any solution, but just sort of, baby steps.
We're going to have to practice this for our Shabbat show, Jeremy.
Yes.
We're going to do those conversations, then come back together. Like, how did that go? Yeah. So shifting a little bit towards kind of transnational or democracy promotion work, which obviously you've been doing for so many years. or at least for the interviews in particular, which was US linked, right? US funded organization. Now that all this funding is being cut so sharply, and including closures of think tanks that also used to work on these types of issues, like the Wilson Center, where I was based for a while, but also the USAID work and so forth. As a real practitioner and a very experienced one at that, how do you see this cuts affecting the on the ground work? And you and I talked a little bit over time about, again, resiliency in this time and creativity. And I was curious, first of all, what have you witnessed as far as the effects on the ground, but also what have been some adjustments that you've made and your colleagues have made to this really transformative shift in American foreign policy?
I mean, everyone is in a state of shock, obviously. And for some people, it's been dramatic because it's not just an economic issue, which is, of course, real. If you have a mortgage, if you have family and kids. But for example, very practically, last summer I was in Lithuania and there are people who have a Russian citizenship who are working in projects like this, and their residency permit in the EU is directly linked to having this job. And so when this job is cut, their residence permit within the EU disappears. And if they're men and they're young, if they go back to Russia, they might be sent to the front line. So you see that this sort of escalation into sheer horror happens like literally within weeks. You have a very stable life, not an easy one because you're in exile, but suddenly it's not that you lost your job, you lost your security, your identity, and you might either you have to flee, but where? Outside of the EU. Maybe for 3 months, you can go to countries like, Serbia, North Macedonia, Turkey, but it's very unstable. And at some point you're running out of money. So what do you do? And these are very practical examples that I'm describing, like real life situations of personal friends. So again, some people are less affected and some people have, second chance and others not so much. And also, if you look at people working on China-related issues, and especially, for example, Uyghur or Tibetans, or people also working on North Korea, who were solely dependent on US money and had no other sources, it's definitely the end, not just of their job, but, for example, of entire organizations that worked for decades sometimes, that suddenly it's gone. There's no website. The archive is lost. And people, of course, are really struggling personally on how to, move forward. So there's a huge human cost that is still happening as we speak. One thing that I want to say is that I think that for especially large organizations, it's also a wake-up call because I think that some got a bit too comfortable and, didn't really think about what happens if we are too dependent on one source of funding. I know because I've been fundraising, it's never easy, but I think that that's a basic rule is that if you rely too much on single major donor, that is absolutely not sustainable. But again, this isn't sort of an earthquake. So I see a lot of people, depending also on their age, their family situation, some sort of just leave the sector and reinvent themselves or take a half-year, 1-year break to think what to do next. For some people, as I said, it's more urgent. So some organizations are trying to help, especially with safety and visa and residency, but that's not always possible. In general, I think that's difficult because at a very dramatic time, you also have very deep philosophical questions. What is happening? Could we have prevented this better? How do we reinvent ourselves? So you have to solve sort of very urgent issues and at the same time think of what is the future of the sector. And again, I don't think anyone has very clear answers. I see different things happening around me with friends and other organizations, with partners. It's very difficult. But we also see that, the US freeze is sort of sometimes it's one step forward and then two back. That's the money that was frozen is unfrozen, or at least the old money, which is overall good news, but it's creating a lot of confusion because you don't know whether you can actually expect sort of the budget you think you had was frozen, then it's back, but maybe not fully. So there's definitely a lot of anxiety.
Very unpredictable.
Yeah.
And do you see this shift as leaving a permanent mark on the sector as a whole? Or do you think that, say, in 4 years, a little less than that, if we re-elect or elect a new president, and things start to kind of go back into believing in democracy again and so forth, do you think this could be reversed? Or is this something that's kind of a real systematic transformation with this whole rethinking, as you said, of big organizations and their donor models, but also these little organizations and the units that kind of are disappearing? Like, can they simply resurrect themselves, right, if the money comes back? Or do you think this is a much more systemic shift that we should be wary of or think about?
I think it's a very systemic shift, and I think that we need to embrace it. I mean, it's not like we really have a choice, because I think that one thing that we should mention is that the Europeans in general, I mean, there are exceptions. I'm going quickly here, but like to say that we care about human rights, and they definitely do, whether it's the EU or even non-EU member states like Norway. But then are you there to fund those projects? And what we have witnessed, at least I think more specifically in the field of former Soviet Union and China and North Korea, is that a huge amount of the funding was actually coming from the US government and US organizations. And some people didn't really realize this. And so I think that the Europeans now are trying to salvage and to sort of, provide a certain level of assistance, but it's never going to be at the level that we had from the US government. It's taking a lot of time. The EU administration is very heavy and very complicated. So they are also bombarded precisely with requirements, as I said, from safety, not just money, but sometimes it's also other issues. But I think the other thing I want to mention that I think is especially for US audiences is that no matter what, this has created a huge trauma in the sector in regard also to the image of the US, because suddenly the US is no longer this reliable friend or partner or ally. And people will think twice, and more than twice, to take US money because they've been burnt out. They remember this sort of, you have the money, you don't have it. Okay, you have it. You have part of it again, but we cannot guarantee what will happen next. And it has destroyed a lot of careers, of personal relations. I think the trust has been broken. And as we know, it's very difficult to rebuild it. I don't think it's impossible, but that will definitely take more than money, will take time, even though, as I said, the European alternative is not fully there yet. And I don't think it will be at the level of the US effort. So there is also this break of trust that I think that is a much deeper and longer issue that we will still face even in the next 10 years, I think.
So even if the US, reemerges as a so-called beacon of democracy again, and there's more funding, the relationships that might form between these American kind of donors and the organizations you're mentioning might be more transactional and cautious versus kind of the deeply trust-based or trust-infused ones that we've experienced in the past. It's like it will take a long time for the partners to trust again, to build connections that are deeper than just money and like taking resources.
Definitely, because as I said, it's not just, someone lost a job. It's the entire archive is gone. People have to move out of their office. It's affecting people at a very deep level, personal, but also within the sector. You have wonderful projects, resources that are gone. And there's no way to bring them back. So people will always remember that. I think that psychologically, it's also in a way easier to put the blame on the US freeze because, as I said, it's also an issue about did you really try to have diversified sources of funding? But then again, I know very much the argument, especially if you work on, let's say, North Korea or, Uyghur issues. It's not like there were many other options besides US money to do your projects. As I said, people are in shock. There's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of anger, of sadness. And I think that the only way out is to really, even though it's not easy to ask those questions now, to rethink, to reimagine this sector.
How do you imagine it, Filip? Can I ask you, how would you transform the sector, even the particular organizations you're working for? What's your vision for the future where the US is at best an unreliable source of funding and support?
That's the $10 million question.
You gotta pay 10 million first. We have to make money first, Jeremy. Then we have to pay Filip.
I think now everybody's going to be like listening very carefully and get immediately very disappointed because again, I don't have a plan. Don't have a big plan or a solution.
Do you have George Soros's phone number?
Well, we saw what happened also in that organization that went through a lot of restructuring and also independently decided to shut down a lot of departments. So I think that that's precisely the issue. To me is, again, it's a phrase that I actually picked up in the US, small is beautiful, because I think that if you're smaller, you keep it at a human scale and precisely you don't over promise or, sort of think that you have, okay, now we're good for the next 5 years and we can relax and we don't have to think about the money. I mean, fundraising is stressful, honestly, because it's very competitive. Now it's, more people who have lost their jobs and institutions asking for less money available outside of the US system for most of it. I think that to really ask the hard questions, to see what are the top priorities, to keep it really small teams, and to constantly review the work that you're doing. And again, for some people, it's very easy. If you have a good passport, you live in a safe country, and you don't have all those issues about security, having a legal resident permit. So some people might be able to actually do this. And for others, as I said, it's almost a matter of life and death. And those people should be prioritized in very specific help. Even just, if not money, at least having a legal status, being able to stay away from their home country that wants them jailed or killed, which is the reality for a lot of people. So again, very cautious about making the difference here. But to me, what we have experienced shows that the old system was not sustainable. So we need to reinvent the whole thing. And it's messy, it's difficult. Not everyone will be able to survive. But we cannot go back to the old model because the old money is gone. The Europeans are not really there. And we have now every week a new war starting on the planet, which makes civil society and media sustainability not exactly the top priority of most governments, even though, of course, war also happens through media, as we see every day. The latest being India and Pakistan, which, affects, for example, flights out of Taiwan that are being cancelled. So the repercussions of war narratives and real wars is endless because we are a very connected and global world, but suddenly it affects all of us. And then again, we usually fall back into our bubble and sort of we decide who is a good guy, who's the bad guy, and then we have confirmation. And then again, we're locked in that bubble. It's really hard. I mean, I think I'm not revealing any secrets. We're all struggling. But I think that's why it's so great that you're doing this podcast, because the way I understand it is that we're listening to each other and having precise a conversation and also acknowledging that we don't have the solutions necessarily. We are struggling. We don't know. Do you have a better idea? Please share. And maybe in 3 months, I'll have a better idea and we can talk again or not. But I think that at least something that we can do.
Yeah, I like the Small and Beautiful capture, especially because it reminded me of Small and Beautiful BRI, Belt and Road Initiative in China as well. Everything is becoming a little more concise, precise, and packaged in this lovely, beautiful way, but nobody quite knows how to do it yet, including China, right? On the last kind of concluding note, I wanted to go back to a lighter space of escapism. You talked about migration flows and, the idea of Americans moving out and just this unusual trend for Americans to reckon with maybe leaving and so forth. I wanted to ask you, if you were sitting in our shoes and thinking about escaping Trump's America, what is the one place in the world you would see as maybe a little bit hopeful? I know it's very hard to see anything as isolated these days because of all the wars you mentioned, but you live in between all these fascinating places as well. Is there somewhere, our listeners as well should consider spending time in if they have a chance to actually reemerge from here for a temporary escape, let's say, or maybe even permanent one?
Well, I think if you're not afraid of cold weather, there's always Finland and Iceland.
Okay, Jeremy.
Because apparently they have high levels of national happiness and democracy.
And there's a direct flight from Nashville to Iceland now.
Oh my goodness.
Here's your escape route.
You have a clear route, Jeremy.
Some people have done their homework.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that it's also about, your own attitude of not excluding migration, but also some people will say, is it exile, which sounds always very dramatic and can be definitely painful. I don't think that you're at that stage. Yes, it's, it might be that you go away for 2 years, 3 years, and then you come back. And you also have to remember that whether you call it exile or migration, it's also an incredible life experience, because the best way to understand your country is also by creating a distance. It can be a physical, it could be a political, cultural one, but looking at the US from outside of the US will probably teach you more than anything, and especially more than your current media bubble. So I think that people should embrace it, and most Americans are of different ethnic origins, like both of you. So there you also have this sort of tradition in your family that not necessarily going back to, Latvia or South Africa, but it could be precisely Iceland, or it could be Taiwan, for example. But I think to really look at institutions, at also the slogans, at the things that you took for granted, and rethink, why did you take them for granted? Because they're not. And that's why I always go back to that sentence that was given in Sarajevo. It can really happen to any country. No one is immune. The Czech Republic, the country of Václav Havel, the beacon of democracy and tolerance. And we might become in September something much more like Hungary. There is no guarantee, and no one is going to help us to change that unless precisely as Czechs, we talk to each other and we understand why we're so divided and why so many people believe in Russian propaganda. I don't have a very good message, but embrace it.
I think your message is pretty clear. It can happen here, and it is. And if we're going to stop it, we have to do something about it. And on that note, Filip, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure talking to you. You've got such a breadth of experience that I think it really is very informative in trying to understand our American moment. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Filip.
Well, thank you to both of you. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I wish you many, many exciting conversations on the podcast.
We're looking forward to pushing this tradition forward and extending. And thank you for being our first inaugural joint podcast guest. We're doing it together for the first time. So very excited to have you. Thank you for the time and the experience and all the context that you provided. It's just, I think, will be fascinating to our listeners.
Thank you so much, and good luck with the project. I'll be following you.
Thank you. The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Maria Repnikova.
And me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show is edited by Cadre Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the Gujong by Wufei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Jimno Piggy No. 1, which is performed also by Wufei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei.
Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review. If you like what we're doing, please take out the paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletters.
Thank you, Filip.
Thank you once again. It was a pleasure.
No.